So let's have a look at SET's view on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Let me start by asking you a question. Why are you viewing this video? What are your reasons to do so? Maybe you're not particularly motivated to watch this video. You might just have stumbled upon it on the internet and just are scrolling around. Maybe you're extrinsically motivated, for example, when you want to get good grades as a student, or because engaging professional development looks good on your CV as an employee or a professional. Or maybe you're intrinsically motivated because you enjoy learning more about SDT. A motivation is defined as having no motivation at all. It's just going through the motions without having any direction, intensity, or persistence. Extrinsic motivation is defined as doing an activity because you want to get an outcome from it, something that's separable from the activity. For example, you might engage in exercising because you want to become more good looking to have more success on the dating market. Or you go to work to get a wage. Intrinsic motivation, in contrast, is defined as doing an activity because you enjoy the activity, you think it's interesting, hence you're doing the activity just because of the activity itself. For example, you might do sports because you enjoy to see what you're capable of, or you like being outdoors, for example, in terms of running. You might also go to work because you like to create something, you like to do something, such as a carpenter who wants to work with wood. Intrinsic motivation is often seen as a summum of motivation. For example, there is a quote that says that choose a job that you love and you never have to work a day in your life. But, of course, not all jobs are only intrinsically motivating. Hence, sometimes you would add extrinsic motivation into the equation, such as when you grade students if they do a good job in learning, or when you pay somebody more when they have engaged in professional development. Yet, what happens if you add extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation? Would some Well, research showed that this might not necessarily be the case, and that adding extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation might lead to an undermining effect where intrinsic motivation decreases or may even disappear. DC examined this issue in his PhD and wrote this article about it. Actually, this article marked the start of what we now know as SDT. DC examined how intrinsic and extrinsic motivation combine. Particularly, he found that intrinsic motivation may decrease when we start rewarding people for an activity that they find already intrinsically motivating. This is particularly the case when the reward is monetary and less so when the reward is verbally, or in other words, when we reward people with giving them compliments. So what did DC do? He invited participants to his lab and divided them in two different groups, an experimental group and a control group. Participants were invited to work on a task involving puzzles. These puzzles are known to be intrinsically motivating. After a while, and participants thought they were ready with the first phase, they could take a break and they could either work further on the puzzles, read some magazines that were made available, or do nothing at all. They did this 3 times in a row. So first working on the puzzles and then having a break in which they could work further on the puzzles, read a magazine, or do nothing at all. Interestingly, in the second time, they were rewarded for working on the puzzles. The experimenters said like, hey, we have some money for this type of research. We can now, for this part, pay you $1 per puzzle that you solve. In the third condition, participants, or in the third time, participants were again told like, we ran out of money, we don't have any available for this part of the task, so no monetary reward is given anymore. This was in the experimental condition. In the control condition, participants also engaged 3 times in making puzzles and also after each time had a break. There was no monetary rewards whatsoever. So now please do take a break and consider how would you examine the undermining effect in this type of research? Which conditions should you compare? Here are the results. DC examined how long participants engaged with the puzzles during their free choice period or during their break. They were free to do whatever they wanted to do, so if they would engage in making more puzzles, DC assumed that this would be an indication of their intrinsic motivation. DC compared the experimental group with the control group, and thus he examined how long participants were still working on the puzzles during the break. Remember that in the experimental condition, participants were previously paid for every puzzle they had solved. To examine the undermining effect or to examine whether the undermining effect took place, DC compared the amount people still spent working on the puzzles in the first round of research compared to the third round of research, because this actually allows to compare how long people would still engage in making the puzzles only because they would be intrinsically motivated. In time 2, in the experimental condition, there was also extrinsic motivation. And DC concluded from these numbers that the undermining effect was there. He could see that in the experimental condition, after being paid, after being extrinsically rewarded for the intrinsically motivating task, participants spent considerably less time on engaging in the puzzle tasks compared to when they first engaged in it. And this difference was significantly different from the control condition where no rewards were given during the whole time. Stated differently, DC examined how long people worked on the puzzles, meaning how intrinsically motivated they were to work on the puzzles in the first time compared to the third time, while they had been rewarded financially in the second time. And he examined these numbers compared with how intrinsically motivation changed from the first time to the third time in the control condition. While in the experimental condition, people worked considerably less long in the third round of time compared to the first, there was no such difference found in the control condition. And this is an example of how the undermining effect might work. DC not only examined the undermining effect in terms of extrinsic monetary rewards, but also examined what happens if you give people extrinsic motivation by motivating them verbally, meaning by giving them a compliment when they are working really well. And here are the results. Again, DC looked at how long people spent on the puzzles during their free choice period or during their break. And again, he compared the experimental condition with the control condition. Remember that in this experiment, in the experimental condition, participants were rewarded verbally and no longer monetary. So they didn't get hard dollars anymore to work on the puzzles, but they were given a compliment. To examine the undermining effect, again, DC compared time 3 with time 1, because these were the conditions in which only intrinsic motivation was present. If the undermining effect would hold true, then the intrinsic motivation in time 3 would be less than the intrinsic motivation in time 1. And here are the results. What do they show? Yes, there is a decrease in intrinsic motivation in the experimental condition, but also such a decrease and even more such a decrease became apparent in the control condition. So people started to get being a little bit bored by the tasks apparently. Stated otherwise, results showed that when you reward people verbally, there seems to be a far less decrease in intrinsic motivation or no decrease in intrinsic motivation compared to in the control condition when no such rewards are apparent. DC's initial research spurred a whole lot of other studies too. After a while, so many studies were conducted that the researchers could do a meta-analysis, which is a quantitative summary of all the research that is available. Within their meta-analysis, DC and colleagues examined two different types of studies examining the undermining effect. Either intrinsic motivation was measured using a free choice behavior paradigm, as we just saw before, or with self-reported interest questionnaires. In terms of the free choice paradigm, participants were given the possibility to choose the intrinsically motivating tasks after finishing something else. So consider this similar to a student engaging in study work during the weekend or an employee finishing a particular task when they have some free time. If we combine all different types of rewards, then we can clearly see that rewarding somebody for an intrinsically motivating task might reduce the time spent on this task later on. Interestingly, there's a difference between the type of rewards as we saw before. If you give people verbal rewards, their intrinsic motivation, as measured with the time they spend on the task afterwards, actually increases rather than decreases, as would be expected based on the undermining effect. However, if we give them tangible rewards, hard dollars, for example, but also a globe to help them with geography or other types of tangible rewards, and then we could clearly see an undermining effect. The undermine effect doesn't happen that much when rewards are given unexpectedly. So, for example, you did a really good job at work and unexpectedly your supervisor gives you promotion. That does undermine your intrinsic motivation then. However, if the reward is expected, the undermining effect does pop up. The degree to which the expected rewards decrease intrinsic motivation might also depend on why why the reward was given. For task non-contingent, there is no reason between or no relationship between the reward and the task. The undermining effect is not there. However, if we give people rewards because they engage in the task or they complete the tasks or they do well on the task, then they might subsequently spend less time on this task. So the undermining effect is very prominent in these cases. Similar results happen in the self-reported studies or studies that use self-reported questionnaires. If we look at verbal rewards, they rather have a positive effect, but tangible rewards have a negative effect on the degree to which people say they like the task afterwards. Unexpected rewards are not so problematic, but expected rewards are, especially when they are giving engagement contingent or completion contingent. So what is the take-home message of the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in SCT? Well, extrinsic motivation might have an undermining effect on intrinsic motivation, so decreasing people's available intrinsic motivation. However, this effect depends on the way people are extrinsically rewarded. When we talk about tangible rewards, such as hard dollars, a bonus, or getting a car if you have good grades as a student, well, this might undermine your motivation to study, and especially your intrinsic motivation to study. However, if you give verbal rewards, this might actually not have such an undermining effect or even increase intrinsic motivation. Are intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation important parts of motivation? Well, this study taps into their relationship with performance. There has lots been written about the so-called undermining effect, about relationships between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Within this study, they summarize everything we know, however, about their joint relationship with performance. Let's have a look at the results. Within this study, the authors scrutinized the literature and examined all different studies that assess the relationships between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and performance. They looked at studies in the school context that dealt with work motivation, physical exercising, and they examined studies including children, adolescents, up to adults. They examined different types of performance, including objective types of performance, which you can measure objectively, such as how hard you can run in terms of exercising, or whether or not you met your targets as an employee. They also assessed subjective types of performance, such as being rated by yourself or the supervisor. Across all these studies, they found that intrinsic motivation is related to performance. It is related across different contexts, across different age groups, and no matter how we assess people's performance. If we look a little bit more closely to the results, then we see that intrinsic motivation is positively related to performance across all different contexts, across all different age groups, and across all different ways of measuring performance. This means when people actually like and enjoy an activity, they will perform better. This happens when people are not rewarded for engaging in the activity, but also when they are being rewarded. So when extrinsic motivation is added to this intrinsic motivation. Interestingly enough, however, if the reward is directly salient, if people actually see that they are also being extrinsically rewarded for the intrinsically motivating behavior, the intrinsic motivation is less predictive of performance. So intrinsic motivation becomes less important in predicting this type of performance. When rewards are indirectly salient, when they're like more in the background, this effect is less pronounced. So that means that intrinsic motivation becomes more important for performance again, and people are less distracted by the extrinsic rewards. Interestingly enough, if we look a little bit further, then we see that intrinsic motivation is particularly important to predict the quality of performance. So, and not so much of the quantity of performance. Let's have a further look. So if we look a little bit closer to the relationship between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation or extrinsic incentives and the quantity and quality of performance, then it shows that intrinsic motivation is particularly important for the quality of performance. So if you are working on an assembly line and you just need to perform quantitatively, which means you have to perform as much as you can, but the type of task is not that difficult, might even be repetitive, then you see that intrinsic motivation is less important than when we consider the quality of performance. So this is the case, for example, when we think about doing something creative or proactive or something complex which requires a lot of thinking. The opposite holds true for extrinsic motivation or extrinsic incentives. These are more important when we have to perform quantitatively. So it's better if you do want to use extrinsic incentives to boost performance, it's better to do that when tasks are rather repetitive, so for example at the assembly line, than when tasks require a lot of complex thinking, so for example when you have to be very creative. Yet you see that intrinsic motivation holds strong relationships with both and mostly with the quality of motivation. So what's the take-home message on the importance of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation for performance? Well, intrinsic motivation matters. If we look at the quantity and quality of performance, then we see that if you have tasks that require quite a quality standard to be met, for example, because it's quite complex or you have to be creative, being intrinsically motivated for these tasks will really boost your performance. If the tasks just require a lot of quantity of performance, so for example, it is repetitive, you have to do the same thing all over again, well, then intrinsic motivations matters less. Also, if we start rewarding people, if we give them incentives for a task in which they are already intrinsically motivated, then it's better to make that reward less directly salient. So it's less obvious for people that they are being rewarded for the task, because then the effect of intrinsic motivation on performance will be stronger than when we actually put the dollars next to the person when he or she is performing the task. So yes, there is a crowding out effect also being shown in this type of research.